So what we're going to do, it's just a starting point today because it's a kind of lengthy thing. We're going to take on the Bible as an overview, right? Well, here's my title, Bible Overview. And I'll tell you why I want to do this, and I think it's worthwhile doing it once in a while. Well, that would help if I turn this on. Here we go. Most of the time when we read the Bible, what do? We read a chapter maybe just a few verses on a Sunday morning. Maybe we do a book, we go into the Old Testament, and we go back and forth, sort of ping-pong it, Old Testament, New Testament, or we stay in the Old Testament and do 2 or 3 books, but they're not necessarily in order. Maybe we just stick to the New Testament. Maybe we don't have a study Bible. We say, oh, that's kind of confusing stuff. I get lost with all the names and all the places, and so we just kind of pick and choose and get through the Bible that way. Well, that's effective. I mean, that certainly is good for us as Christians. But you know what we end up with? We end up with kind of like a box full of puzzle pieces, right? Each one is pretty and each one's nice, but sometimes we don't put them together to form the big picture. And so that's what I'm hoping we do today, that it really start today. And that is to step back, or to put the pieces down and step back and see what the whole thing looks like. And so that's why I call it an overview of the Bible. We don't know much about the Bible, right? I mean, think about it. We probably couldn't identify the different people groups that are in the Bible, can we? I mean, they kind of come and go, and they're in some chapters, and they're not in others.
They're mixed up.
Oh, yeah.
The Babylonians and the Syrians, the
Yeah.
Chaldeans.
And how many ites are there in there? There are a lot of ites.
Termites.
We don't know the geography, right? We're going to talk about that a little bit. I mean, we just know battles take place, and it all kind of seems like the same thing. They reference going up to Jerusalem, and we say, okay, so we go up to Los Angeles. Is it in the same sense? No. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. We certainly don't know much about the culture of the time. Jesus interacts with different religious groups, and we often don't know, well, what are these groups, do they have something in common? It looks like they're kind of angry at each other in many cases. Do you remember Paul got them arguing among themselves? So something's going on there. You have groups like the Sadducees, and you have something called the Essenes that aren't even in the New Testament, yet they play a big role as far as the New Testament documents go. So this is the kind of stuff, and I know I hate to preview this and have people walk out because they don't want to do some of this, but it's going to sound a lot like a college class or something, but I just want to step back and say, well, can we take a look at the big picture of the Bible for the next couple of Sundays? So, am I the only map nut in here, or do other people like maps? Okay, good. A few of you like maps, that's great. So let's start with where the whole thing takes place. It's called the Ancient Near East, sometimes abbreviated ANE. And you'll probably recognize, if you don't recognize these places, you'll probably recognize the modern places to be Turkey. Right, does that look familiar? Israel will be down here. You got Iraq over there. Egypt. Isn't that interesting? That's got to be one of the oldest surviving countries in the history of the world, don't you think? I haven't checked to see how long China has been China, but I mean, as long as you can go back, there's been Egypt, right? It's always anchored that corner down here. So we got Africa down here, we got Europe up here, and of course Russia and all up that way. So Persian Gulf, which has played a pretty prominent role as the oil has been flowing back and forth. But if you take a look, this over in the red there, it says Mesopotamia. It's a fancy word, just means between the rivers. What are the 2 rivers that are the biggies? Tigris and the Euphrates. And again, unfortunately, they've been in the news as our troops have gone through that area. But they come up this way and then water this area and then come down to the Persian Gulf. So those are the big rivers. For a long time, the Hittites here, we had no historical information about the Hittites outside the Bible. It just, in the Old Testament, talked about the Hittite Empire. And so people who were cynics and skeptics said, oh, come on, it's in the Bible. They probably didn't even exist. It was just a bunch of fairy tales. And then 100 years ago, they dug up the Hittite Empire. Surprise, the Bible had it right. The land of Canaan down here, the Mediterranean in this area, and Egypt, of course, down at the bottom. If you notice something, it looks like the empires tend to go up this way, and then they come down along the coast on into Egypt, like an upside-down U. That's called the Fertile Crescent. I don't know if you ever heard that reference, because it does look like a crescent kind of on edge there. Notice there's not much going on in between these areas. You know why, right?
There's nothing to do.
Who's going to live out there, right? It's as dry as can be. It's all desert this way. So if you wanted to travel, you didn't travel this way. You would come up this way and down this way. This is the major artery for the two empires. You get somebody over here would get big every once in a while, right? That's the Mesopotamian area. Different empires would come along, and then you'd have Egypt down here. So you have these two great big empires. Sometimes they were strong, sometimes they'd be weak, right? It would always be kind of a back and forth thing. And if they wanted to fight each other, guess where they would come? Canaan was in between. And so for years and years and years, as you read through the Old Testament, you're going to read about somebody getting big over here and coming over and challenging the Egyptians, or the Egyptians getting powerful, and they come up the coast here and strike anybody that could cause them problems. So here's the poor little shuttlecock in the way here, right, getting batted back and forth. So many times you'll find some kind of empire comes over here and says, which side are you on? Oh, you have to think, and you have to think very carefully. If it's, for example, the Babylonians come over here, and they say, which side are you on? You think about, well, how strong is Egypt right now? And if you guess wrong, you're in big trouble, right, because they just stomp you on the ground. So you'd have to be very careful. This poor little land suffered greatly because of these two empires, back and forth and back and forth. And we'll talk about the empires a little bit later. Any questions about the map or just the general location for some of this?
Neither Israel nor Poland have had the opportunity that Switzerland had of having the mountains to protect them.
Yeah.
They've been able to be neutral for centuries, really.
Yeah.
And you get those flat places and you get marched over
Yeah.
every time.
Oh yeah, exactly right. Yeah, nothing protects them geographically down here from that empire or that empire. Well, let's take a little close-up then, right? So now we found the big picture. What about a little bit closer picture? This would be ancient Palestine. My favorite up here is the Plain of Sharon. But do you see the green is basically the flat, like Paul was talking about, extremely flat. So these are the major roads that go up and down here. When the Israelites come in, they end up settling in the mountain areas, right? Not on the plains, up in the mountain areas. And so it was kind of a rough, rugged existence. Here was civilization. This was not civilization. This was civilization. And so if you remember in the Old Testament, it'll talk about the Israelites having to go down to the Philistines to get their farm implements and to get the iron working and all that kind of stuff, because this is where you had the real, this would be like downtown San Diego, and this would be Humul, or El Centro, or something, right? But it was safer for the Jews up here, right? You don't have these empires marching up and down the roads here, so they would sit up in the mountains. There's Jerusalem. It's actually mountainous. It's like 3,000 feet or so. Some of you, I'm sure, have been there. Paul?
It's fascinating to take the bus ride from the Dead Sea up through the Wadi, and because the road's so narrow and you look down, but amazing, you can just picture how high up you're going, and it makes exactly what you're talking about stand out.
Yeah, sure. So when Jesus tells a story, for example, in the New Testament about a man going to Jericho, and he gets waylaid, you know, he was up here and he was heading down, Jericho's down by the Dead Sea, so it was a pretty tricky road, and it was snaky, and so if you were a robber, you could sit and wait around a corner as a traveling, you know, group came by, and your robbers could jump on them and beat them up and take whatever they needed, because nobody could see that, because it wasn't a straight road. It was a snaky, you know, going down the mountainside. So people in Jesus' time, when they say, oh, there's a guy going to Jericho, this is not going to turn out well, you know, because they knew the story of that. This is just part of what's called the Rift Valley. You ever heard of that term, Rift Valley? It's just a big old crack in the Earth's crust that starts up here and it goes down clear into Africa. And so it's this low, low area, right? The Dead Sea is low, and then the Jordan River is part of that low area there. So here you got the Jews up here, and you've got the more civilized people over here. And what would the Jews have to do? They'd often have to go down this way to get things, but they'd also go down this way, and the Philistines or whoever would come up this way to have their fights. So their fights would kind of be in the mid-range here, right, between this mountainous area and right there on the coast. So you have David and Goliath, for example, fighting in the valley in between the two here. So when people say in the Old Testament, let us go up to Jerusalem, you know what they're talking about? Not going north. Jerusalem is up, right, elevation-wise, and so you could be here and say, let's go up to Jerusalem, because you're in a lower area and you move up. So if you ever hear that in the Old Testament, let us go up to Jerusalem, they're talking about the height more than north, south, those kinds of things that we think of today. I always thought that it must have been a wonderful trip when the pilgrims would go to Jerusalem and they're down here someplace and they're getting closer to Jerusalem for celebrating a holiday. To see that up on the hill there and to see that temple, and it must have caught the sunlight, and they would start singing their psalms of praise to God as they're getting closer and closer as they finally see Jerusalem up there. I mean, what an amazing sight that would have been. Let's start in the Torah then, right? The 5 books of Moses. In Genesis, we're introduced to God, and most of us say, isn't that nice, good, we're glad God created everything. But if you slow down for just a second and think about the kind of God that's revealed in the book of Genesis compared to the other gods all over the world, there are lots of differences, and our God is such an amazingly different God. He was above nature, wasn't he? He creates nature, and many of the other gods are created somehow, but nature was there first, and they don't really control nature. I mean, we have a God that's above the storms. We have a God that's above the rain. We have a God that's above the earthquakes, right? He takes care of the world. A singular God compared to the many, it's always chaotic, isn't it? When you read about the Greek gods, they argue with each other, and it's chaos, right? They're not in control of anything. And there's a whole bunch of them running around, getting in each other's way. He's a careful creator. How many times does he say it is good? It's good. It's turned out the way he wanted it to. God's the master craftsman in the book of Genesis. Not so other places. It's a world that comes into existence and it's chaotic and nobody can control it and everybody's running around like crazy. Our God is an ethical God as revealed in Genesis. He punishes sin. He's unhappy about certain things. But look at the gods, especially, I always think of the Greek gods, I guess. I think I grew up on them more than any other group. What kind of gods do you get there? They're lustful, they're jealous, they're petty, they try to harass each other. Remember the Iliad and the Odyssey? I don't know if you read any of those. They have their favorites. If you're a woman, look out, because one of the gods was always trying to rape you. I mean, it's just an awful, awful thing. They're like, I don't know, teenagers with, full of testosterone and stuff. It's just, they're nuts, He can't be manipulated, can he? The God that's revealed in the Bible. Compare that to the gods, other places where you have to do incantations and you've got to cut yourselves. Remember the story of Baal and the worship of Baal, and there's Elijah on Mount Carmel, and he's saying, keep going, guys, maybe your God will come too if you just do something else. And they got all these things they're doing to themselves, trying to wake up their God. But that's the kind of God that's revealed. It's a very different God than you see in all these other documents that you read about other gods. The other thing I think is really nice about this, because I like science a lot, it's the kind of the kind of God that is revealed in the Old Testament. We get our science from the Jews, and of course Christians spread it all over the world, but most people today think there's some kind of clash between the Judeo-Christian worldview and science, that they're at war. That's not true at all. Science came out of the Judeo-Christian worldview. So I wanted to take just a second and have you think about that. God is rational in the Old Testament. Now, how would that help science? If you decide your God is a rational God.
Well, it would allow you to explore where the truth is. And if God is a rational God, you'd be aiming toward that truth as you explore what's out there.
Yeah, the world must reflect that rationality. When we do something rational, there's care given and it makes sense and you can pull things apart and see what the component parts are. That gives you a lot of enthusiasm, doesn't it? A lot of optimism as you do that. God's separate from his creation. That's not true in some other religions. In other religions, God is in the pond, God is in the tree, God is in the cloud. So therefore, are you really going to cut a tree down to look at the tree? I don't think so, because that's God. You don't mess with the animals, you don't mess with any of that stuff, you just leave it alone and walk away from it. But it's okay for us to interact with nature because God is beyond nature, he's not part of nature. God's world is real. The Hindus say the world is illusion, it's Maya. Well, if it's Maya, if it's an illusion, are you going to mess with it? Why would you bother with an illusion? You don't try to figure out how illusions work, they're not real. But in the Old Testament we say, no, it's a real world. It's really there. God's unchanging. Would that help you as far as science goes? Right? If you say, well, maybe gravity is going to be different tomorrow. Maybe the way the sun rises and sets is going to be different tomorrow. Maybe, whatever it is, there's no natural rhythm to nature at all. Maybe it's going to change all the time. It's like on shifting sands, and that's not the Christian and the Judeo-Christian worldview at all. We're made in His image. Well, guess who gets some of that rationality? I'm not saying we're as rational as God, but therefore our minds work well enough that we can go out and begin to explore the world. Johann Kepler, one of the guys that figured out how the planets go around the sun, said, I'm just thinking God's thoughts after him. He had a very optimistic view. The early scientists were Christians. Copernicus and Kepler. Copernicus was a priest. Copernicus and Kepler and Galileo and all these people, they didn't see any problem. They figured, we can use our minds. God gave us these minds. This world is real. Let's go out and let's find out what's going on there. Let's see what God did. And then the last thing, history is going someplace. That's optimistic, isn't it? Instead of just cyclical, nothing is going to change. There's no rhyme. There's no reason. We don't know why things are happening. The Bible says, no. You look at the Old Testament, God starts a plan, doesn't He? There's sin, and God says, I'll take care of it. And He says, I'm going to do it through the Jewish nation. And then history starts moving. So again, there's optimism that things are getting someplace. I mean, think about today. Aren't we an optimistic society? We say, let's come up with some kind of scientific invention because it's going to help things later on. We don't say, well, what's the point? Right? It's just all going to be cyclical. We're just going to spin our wheels. We're not getting anywhere. That's not the view that Christians have today. So modern science, Genesis, right? It was the foundational book to say, hey, it's okay. We can go out and start to understand our world. Let's move along then, it's still in Genesis, but let's consider the movement of Abraham. This arrow represents the direction that he took. Does that again look like a fertile crescent move? And so all he's doing is following that traditional pattern that a lot of people did. He was not the only one to do this, but he's moving from down here close to Babylon and all that area and up to Haran, and he gets the message from God, go down to Canaan. I don't think we appreciate what that message was and his reaction to that. I mean, what if you wake up someday and God tells you to go to El Centro? I hate to pick on El Centro. I don't know, maybe I should think Needles, Blythe. Right, and we'd say, oh, I'm going to leave the beauty. I'm going to leave culture. I'm going to leave, you're patting her. We got a, Jan, are you from that area?
Pardon me?
Are you from that area?
No.
Oh, okay. I don't mean, I'm not picking on anybody here.
We're coming up with towns that are just carbon copies of each other.
No, okay. But I mean, the idea is you would probably go with real hesitant steps, wouldn't you? To say, I got to leave everything I like here. I got to leave culture. I got to leave doctors. I got to leave all these wonderful things to go where? And so for him to come down here, there was nothing here. Remember, the civilizations are here or they're over here, but they're not here. This is terrible. This is a bad area to go. But talk about faith. He says, okay, I'm going to leave these wonderful places that I've been at where I can really flourish, and I'm going to go out there. And that's a great step of faith, not just moving, but moving to some place that's as out of it as this would have been for him. This is something that's just starting to be discovered in the last, let's say, 20 years or so. As we move into the last part of Genesis, you know the story. There's a famine and the people come down to Egypt. The Israelites come down to Egypt and then they settle there. And everything's great for a while. And then Exodus starts off saying, a Pharaoh comes along and he didn't know the children of Israel anymore, right? There's a disconnect that happens at that point. So people look at these stories and they say, well, those are nice stories, but do you have any evidence that the Jews were ever in that land? Yeah, they're actually doing some work now, archaeological work. So I don't have time to do a ton of these things, but I just want you to give you an idea that even though we're talking, thousands of years ago, evidence is starting to be found. There's a place, and I'll show you where it is. My grandmother used to say land of Goshen, right? Okay, there is a land of Goshen, right? I'll show you a map in just a second, but it's near the mouth of the Nile River. It's an area called Goshen. So what are they starting to find in Goshen? They're starting to find things that look Canaanite, not Egyptian, in this one area. Now, it doesn't say specifically these are Israelite structures, but they're finding pottery and architecture and things that are not Egyptian in this one area, as if some kind of group of people settled there. So we can't say for sure, but I think that's intriguing. They have wall paintings that show all sorts of nomadic traders. There were a lot of trading that went on during this time period, roughly the time of the Israelites coming in. And you can tell definitely these are Semitic people. There's an inscription about Eastern people, right? That would be people from the land of Canaan who didn't worship Ra. How about this? They have found lists of slave names from Hebrew records, and the slave names are Semitic. And they're Hebrew, more specific. Hebrew names in Egypt that they found. They found wall murals with Semitic slaves. So is this ultimate proof? I don't think so, but it's an interesting hint. It's an interesting tease. There's the land of Goshen. There's the Nile as it kind of turns into 20 different directions here. By the way, it's a little confusing in Egypt. There's something called Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. I don't know if you've heard those two terms. So we, with our rationality, we look at a map of Egypt, we say, well, this must be Upper Egypt. No, it's the other way around, right? Upper Egypt is here because that's where the Nile River is coming from, and then it moves this way, so it's going down to the sea. So this is Lower Egypt, and then you have Upper Egypt. Never mind, it's probably more information than you wanted. But here's the land of Goshen, right?
Isn't the Nile the only major river in the world that flows north?
I don't know, that's a good piece of trivia. The only major river, yeah, the Amazon is east. Yeah,
I think so, but I don't know.
You're right.
yeah. That's weird. I wonder what, yeah, because the earth spins this way, so maybe that causes more of the rivers to flow that way. So you got the land of Goshen down here, and then of course the children of Israel come across here. But you notice if you read the stories of the coming out, Joshua and all, when they come out of the desert and all, they don't come in the front door, do they? They go around the back door. They go in through the east into the west. Any ideas? I think there's a reason for that, but why don't they just march up the coast here and then come into the land that's been promised to them? Why would they go? Because it looks kind of out of the way. They come down and Moab gives them a bad time. They come up here and then they go across.
Avoid war.
What's that?
To avoid war.
Yeah, this is the highway, right? This is 78. Hope it's not as crowded as the 78, but that's the highway there. Are you really going to take your ragtag group up and down that highway when there could be large armies moving very easily? So what does he do? He gets off the main route, right? He comes around the backside and then enters Canaan from the east, west. By the way, they have, again, this is probably more history than you want to know, but they have all sorts of letters, pleas from the Canaanite kings to the Egyptian king saying, could you please help us? We're being invaded. And it's the time period of Joshua. Is that interesting or what? Now, they don't say Israelites, right? They don't use that term, but they say, help, we're being invaded. You've protected us in the past. Come, we need some help. So these are the Canaanite leaders worrying about that. Then you get to the book of Judges. The book of Judges is awfully frustrating, isn't it? Because the children of Israel again and again do stupid things. Human nature. But they're doing okay, and then they walk away from God, because after all, they're doing okay. Who needs God when things are fine? They fall into a problem. Some group comes in, takes them over, and they cry out to God. God sends them somebody to rescue them. They're called judges. Doesn't mean they're judges like with the white wigs and the black outfits. It's just a tribal leader. And so if you've ever heard that word judge, don't think about modern day judges. These are tribal leaders. So they cry out. Somebody rallies them together. Due to God's miraculous intervention, they cast off whatever the tyranny is, and they say, well, thanks, we're okay now. And then they go through this process again and again. So if you read the book of Judges, the book doesn't seem to get anywhere. They have one tribal leader who helps them out, and then that tribal leader fades from the scene. They're in trouble later on. And you could almost pick any part of Judges. It doesn't matter if you start at 6 or 8 or 9. It's going to be the same all the way through. Right? So it's pretty sad. Here are 3 of the leaders I think are really interesting. I always thought, what an amazing woman Deborah must have been, because what's going on here? All of the tribes turn to her. I mean, this is a patriarchal society, right? The guys are the ones in charge, and yet they are so desperate, and she was so strong. They say, help. And so she's written a song. It's called The Song of Deborah. Take a look at that in the book of Judges. Village life in Israel ceased until I, Deborah, arose a mother in Israel. I mean, can you hear that? I came along, I'm a mother, for heaven's sakes, and I ended up leading the entire group to victory. So she's proud of that and kind of amazed, I'm a mom. And I'm ending up leading the entire Israelite congregation here. Of course, Gideon, we know his story. The angel of the Lord came where Gideon was threshing wheat in a winepress to keep it from the Midianites. The Lord is with you, mighty warrior. I just think there's a whole lot going here that's fascinating. First of all, it says, and we kind of skim over it quickly, he's threshing wheat in a winepress. Where do you normally thresh wheat?
Outside.
Outside.
Outside in the field, yeah.
Yeah. Why are you doing it outside?
Because
Chaff.
The wind will blow the chaff away, and then the heavier kernels are going to fall to the ground. He's in a wine press. Is he a mighty warrior at this moment? He's hiding. I'm trying to figure out how he got the stuff to separate. I don't know how he did that, but so he's trying to separate the stuff in it. Probably not very effectively. I imagine he's looking over his shoulder all the time because the Midianites are big trouble, right? They've come in, they've taken over, and here's poor Gideon, and an angel shows up and says, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." I'm guessing Gideon looked over his shoulder. Where's the warrior? It's you, Gideon. Really? And we see several times, Gideon's not so sure of himself, is he? I mean, he's putting fleeces out, and it's kind of a hesitant guy, but God took care of him. I mean, we're in the same boat, right? We're pretty hesitant people, and God comes along and says, I can use you. You're a mighty warrior down deep. You don't know it yet, but you are. Have you seen those Gideon Bibles, by the way, that on the outside they have that little image of that jug? It's from the story of Gideon. They go to the Midianite camp, and they break those jugs that have candles inside them, and all of a sudden lights flare out all over the place. So I think that's kind of a cool image. Of course, the other one, it's a sad story, is Samson. So here are two success stories, but then we get some negative judges, right? We get Samson that comes along. We meet Samson, and he says this. We learn about his birth and all that. Samson saw a young Philistine woman. Oh, this is not good right off, right? The Philistines are down, right? He has wandered out of the Israelite territory. He's gone to the coast. That's where the Philistines are. That's where civilization is. He's not supposed to be messing with Philistine people, right? These are two different groups of people. But when he comes back, he says to his father and mother, I've seen a Philistine woman in Timnah. Now get her for me as my wife. First of all, it doesn't sound very nice the way he's talking to mom and dad. Huh? Do this now. And of course, everything goes down from that point, doesn't it? Him and the whole woman angle there. But he was supposed to be set apart. And he becomes kind of I guess you call him a negative symbol. You know, what can go wrong if you don't stay holy and separate? And we find out just a terrible ending for Samson. So now we got the people in the land, we got the judges, and you've had that cyclical account in the book of Judges. And Samuel opens up by the people coming to Samuel, who's their prophet, and they're making a request. Anybody know what they're requesting? We want a king. We want a king. Come on, we want to be like everybody else. Well, I can kind of see, I mean, that was obviously the wrong thing to do, but I can see in a way why they're saying that, because they've gone through these judges, right? And it's been kind of a nonstop cyclical thing. We're okay, and then we're bad, and then we're okay, and they go, good heavens, everybody else has got these strong, powerful kingdoms, and we're at their mercy all the time. So they said, Samuel, ask God, we need a king. And Samuel says, really? You sure? And he gives us a little speech. This is what the king will do. You really want a king? He will take your sons and make them serve with his chariots. He'll take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He'll take 1/10 of your grain and give it to his officials. Your men servants and the best of your cattle he will take for his own use. When that day comes, you will cry out for relief. Yes, I was going to ask, does that sound pretty modern? All the government you're paying for, right? Somebody once said, be grateful you're not getting all the government you pay for. But that's what's going on. It went on in that time. You put somebody in charge, and you lose some of your freedom, and your money, and a lot of other restrictions come along. So it was going on thousands of years ago. Really, you want that kind of stuff? Yes, we do. Okay, so they get their king. Now, the first king was Saul. You know that story about Saul. And Saul is a failure, and along comes David. And I'm not sure as we read the stories of David, if we really appreciate all the things that David represented to those people. He was such a symbol and such an incredible figure that more space is devoted to him than anybody else in the Old Testament. And you say, well, why him? Because he had a good heart? Sure, but look at these other things. He did have a heart for God. He was a great warrior. I mean, look at the things that he accomplished against these groups like the Philistines. He was a political leader. He was their king, for heaven's sakes, for quite a period of time. He's the one who captured Jerusalem. And we know how central that's been to the Jewish nation ever since. He made it the capital. It wasn't a capital, it was just a podunk city, and he said, this is going to be the capital. You know, what he did was kind of what happened with Washington, D.C. You had the northern colonies, you had the southern colonies, and they're bickering and arguing. They said, let's put Washington, D.C., let's create a capital city between the two so we don't get that arguing. It's going to be kind of neutral ground. That's what David did. You had southern tribes arguing with northern tribes. They never got along real well. And they said, let's put Jerusalem and make that the capital in between. So if you look on a map, Judah is south of that, and all the Israel colonies are north of that. He's the one who brought the ark to Jerusalem. He's the one that's given the promise of a Messiah. And he's a writer. What a combination. How many people do you know who are literate and artistic and politically adept and warrior status? I thought about this before I came in today. I thought the only person I can think of is Winston Churchill. He got prizes for his writing. He was a fighter. He actually was in war. Bullets zinged around him. He was captured eventually. He was a political leader. He painted. But it's pretty rare to get somebody like that. So no wonder the Jews love David to death here. Well, I'll tell you what. Let me just end on this one, because remember we're doing 2 parts here. Is that about time, do you think?
Yeah.
Okay. Here's the city that David captured, and no wonder they wanted to make it a capital. It's sitting up with valleys around it, which makes it pretty hard to attack. Here's the Kidron Valley. You remember that from New Testament times. There's the Mount of Olives over on the far right. Down here is the Valley of Hinnom. When Jesus wanted to give people a picture of hell, he called it Gehenna, which is the Hinnom Valley. Well, why that? Because the people would drag out all their trash and refuse and dead animals, bring it down here and set them on fire. It's kind of like an eternal fire that just burned all the time. So Jesus says, you want to know what hell's like? It's that burning fire out there that goes and goes and goes forever. So it's kind of a visual thing there that Jesus was picturing. So we got to the time of David. And David's kingdom, if you take a look, this is just a general idea. It's about 1000 BC. If you want kind of a rough time period, we're going to move today through about 1,000 years. So it's going to be a fast tour. But here's David's kingdom in purple. And again, you notice it doesn't slop over into Egypt at all, and it certainly doesn't go into Mesopotamia at all, because you still have kingdoms over there on each side of Israel. But here's the good news for Israel at this time. Neither of these 2 threats were much of a threat during this time. And so since both of the Mesopotamia and the Egyptians were a little less militaristic, a little less aggressive, it allowed the people in the middle, in this time period be David, allowed his kingdom to spread. And for his son Solomon as well. So when you hear about Solomon meeting the Queen of Sheba, a lot of people think it was a trade deal. And you can see, I think we talked last time, that the major road would be going up and down the edge of the Mediterranean here. So you had trade going back and forth. Now, if you're Solomon, let's say, you could control those trade routes. You would tax some caravan that went through, and you tax them, and you tax them, and you tax them. And you made a lot of money off of this. And so the kingdom, you know what it's like under Solomon, pretty wealthy. And it was because of the trade, because there was peace. There was not war at this time. So it's a good comment about the value of peace. So Solomon comes along, so now we're in about the 900s BC. He writes Proverbs. And I love the book of Proverbs. I don't know if you like it as much as I do, but I'm just going to give you 2 or 3 things to think about here with the book of Proverbs. That you could spend weeks just doing Proverbs, huh? Look at Proverbs 10:27. I want you to think about this for a second. The fear of the Lord adds length to life, but the years of the wicked are cut short. Now, we could take Proverbs one of 2 ways, couldn't we? We could say every verse is a promise, and it's always going to come true. But if you look at this verse that we just read, do you know any old people who are evil? Yeah, I do. Do you know some really sweet people whose lives have been cut short? Yeah. So what do you think is going on here? Because this seems to claim that the poor, the wicked are going to be cut short and the good people will live forever. Not always true, is it? Proverbs is a general statement of life. It's not a specific promise for every single person. It says, generally, this is the way life goes. And so we don't want to take every verse and say, well, God didn't fulfill this. This didn't turn out right. Sure, because this is kind of like do you know what a bell curve is in statistics and all? You know, you have a rarity in one area of the bell curve, and then most people are up here in the bell curve, like height or weight or whatever, and then down here a few more. So this is sort of the bell curve approach in Proverbs. It seems to make general statements about life rather than specifically in every single case to be the truth.
Could that be referring to eternity?
Well, I don't know. Only if you took the wicked and annihilated them,
Well,
which doesn't sound like eternity, right?
we're looking forward to an eternity of life, and they will have an eternity of life too, but it's going to be a very unpleasant one.
Yeah, that's true. I think it's probably more focused on this life, though. I mean, most of Proverbs seems to be how you get by in this world, doesn't it? Solomon's writing for his son and all, but that's a possible interpretation as well. I love 26:4 and 5, and you kind of scratch your head when you first encounter something like this. Do not answer a fool according to his folly, or you'll be like him yourself. Answer a fool according to his folly, or he'll be wise in his own eyes. Is that contradictory advice? It says you should answer a fool, or you should not answer a fool. Isn't that interesting? It's actually going to be up to you. You decide. Is this the kind of person, if you talk to that individual, he or she will actually learn from what you want to talk about? Or is it going to be a waste of time? If it's a waste of time, don't answer them. You're going to be like them yourself. Before you know it, you're going to be babbling along with them. So I thought Proverbs is interesting. It's got places like that where it says, it's up to you. You decide how you want to handle that particular situation. And then I just referenced chapter 31. What's being described in 31? Does anybody know? It's even titled, The Ideal Wife. Here's a book that was written almost 1000 BC in a time of patriarchal governance, right? The men tended to run everything. And yet, if you look at that, it's a very modern woman that's being described there. She goes out of the home. Yes, she takes care of the home, and yes, she takes care of the husband. But she goes out and she even buys land in there. It's a very interesting view of women. It's all parts of life is what she's involved in. She's a rounded individual that participates in the community. People outside the home admire her. Her husband admires her. Kids are well controlled and things like that. So I think that's an interesting picture. Plus, the thing about an acrostic is every verse starts with the next letter of the Hebrew alphabet. So in other words, if we were doing it in English, our first verse would start with A, and the next verse would be B and C and so on. So you know what it's really saying is this is a woman from A to Z. This is a woman that does everything. And so they do the whole Hebrew alphabet. And most of us don't think about that, but all through the Old Testament, there are these literary devices being used. And if you have a good Bible that has some good notes with it, you'll pick up on those things. So use a study Bible if you have a chance, because it makes you appreciate that when God allowed people to write the Bible, He gave them freedom to be creative. It's not just that they sat there with a pen in their hand waiting for Allah to give them information, just to copy stuff from heaven. It wasn't that approach at all, like Islam and other religions believe. These people were given the ability to do different things and to shape the material a way that was pleasing. And so when you read the Bible, I think it's really enjoyable to read because you come across things like this that are a lot of fun. Well, unfortunately, after Solomon, you know what happens. The kingdom doesn't stay together. You'd had these internal stresses that have been going on for a long, long time, and finally you got rid of a really strong king in the death of Solomon, and the kingdom just snaps apart. And the northern 10 tribes, which is really confusing, by the way, the northern 10 tribes are called Israel. Well, the whole nation had been called Israel up until then. So now you got to think, wait a minute, what's going on here? So you have 10 tribes up at the top half of the screen there. Down below you have Judah and Benjamin forming the tribe of Judah, forming the nation of Judah. Judah gets to keep the kingdom in Jerusalem. Anybody know what the kingdom becomes as far as the capital for Israel? Yeah, Samaria becomes the capital. So if you ever hear them talk about Samaria, keep that in mind. That's going to be the new key city for the people of the north. You got the Philistines down here, and you got the Phoenicians as well. So into this scene of chaos and fighting and civil war, and in many cases flourishing, in come the prophets. And a lot of people think, oh yeah, the prophets, they come around, they say, hey, let me tell you about the future. Well, that wasn't really the purpose of a prophet, was it? The prophet was to say, thus saith the Lord, I am here from God, I have a message for you. And most of it was, get your act together. Well, what act was going on? Well, if you go back to Exodus, what happened? The children of Israel are miraculously delivered. They get out in the desert. Moses meets God. Moses brings down the Ten Commandments. And they're establishing a Mosaic covenant at that point, aren't they? And it's a two-way covenant. Just like if you write a contract, think of a covenant like a contract. You go to Home Depot and you say, I want so much carpet. And they say, okay, we'll deliver this carpet X date, but you got to sign for it and you have to pay for it. So you have a responsibility and Home Depot has a responsibility. Well, same thing happened here. This is a Mosaic covenant that the prophets are coming to tell the people about. They're saying, look, you signed a covenant. You said you would do certain things and God would bless you. But if you didn't do those things, God said, look out, right? You're going to get in big, big trouble. So here come the prophets. They're not coming up with anything new. They're just reminding the people, look at that covenant. You signed it. Look at the document, in a sense. Look at your signed agreement. You're not abiding by it. And so the warnings were out there. Well, it didn't take long. Here came the first of the disasters for the nation. It was a group of, in the Mesopotamian area that came along called the Assyrians. Nineveh was their capital city. And they were some of the most vicious fighters. Wow, were they unbelievably tough people. It just scared everybody to death. If you saw the Assyrians coming over the hill, it was terrible news because they loved to hurt, they loved to slaughter, they loved to take off people into captivity. You can't see it very well, but up here in the corner are spikes, and they've driven bodies into the spikes. That was their idea of threatening and scaring the people that they were going to come up against, and archers and so on. So what did the Assyrians do? They come over from the north, and they're coming up against Israel initially, the nation of the 10 northern tribes. And they succeed. They wipe out the northern, well, they don't wipe them out, but they take over the northern 10 tribes. And their idea of making subjected people stay in line was to pull out a lot of them out of the land, bring in others who didn't even live there, bring them into the land, so that you couldn't have a real revolution, right? You've pulled off so many people. So what they did is they hauled off the 10 tribes, not everybody, but a good portion of them. They hauled them off. Many of them, they put iron hooks around their jaws and dragged them behind horses off to captivity. I mean, it's a vicious, vicious group of people. So now you get that story. Anybody ever heard that story of the 10 lost tribes of Israel? I don't know if that's ever been around, but ever since then, people have wondered what happened to the 10 lost tribes, because they don't come back. We'll find out who comes back later, but they don't come back. They're just sent out and go off to different lands that they're not comfortable with, not familiar with, and kind of mix in probably with some of the tribes, the people that they meet there. Omar?
Gary, can we apply what they were doing to what is happening or has happened recently? For instance, the Russians took people out of Estonia and they put a lot of their own people in. They had no problems with Estonia then.
Yeah.
So their doings have been passed down as to things that other nations do and have been pretty successful.
Yeah, you don't have that core of nationalism anymore if you drag off a lot of people. What's there to rally around? That's a good point. You know, so it's been done more than once. So there have been stories. Where did those 10 lost tribes go? And people have romanticized this and turned this into all sorts of crazy fictions. There was a group called British, I won't get the name right, British Anglism or something like that. They felt that the 10 lost tribes had ended up in England. I don't think so, but it made the English feel real good about themselves. You know, that, yeah, we're part of the 10 lost tribes. Nobody knows. They just mixed in with other groups and they just fade. They disappear from history at that point. Now maybe you can see why in Jesus' day, think about that map again. So you got the 10 tribes have kind of disappeared and they've been mixed in with other groups of people. What did the Jews think of the 10 tribes, that area? They thought of them as mongrels. And so that's where the Samaritans were. So what happens? People would walk, the good Jews in the south would walk around that area. They didn't want to be near those people because they called them dogs and half-breeds and all this kind of stuff. So when Jesus tells that story of the Good Samaritan, it just shocked people to death because the Jews couldn't stand them. They were half-breeds. What are you telling a story about a good half-breed for? Be like us today talking about the good member of Al-Qaeda. I would be horrified to think there's a good member of Al-Qaeda. Well, Jesus' story was the same thing. It all started back here with the Assyrians as they came into the land. Now, what's fascinating to me, at least, about this, because I like history, they don't stop after taking off the 10 tribes, hauling them off. Well, what's the king going to look at next? Those 2 southern tribes. Well, Hezekiah is the king at this point in the south. So he prays to God, please deliver us from these Assyrians. If you want to see some interesting psychological warfare, take a look at 2 Kings sometimes, and the story is repeated in Isaiah, right in the middle of Isaiah. You ever notice that in Isaiah? Isaiah is poetry up to about 36 or 37 chapter, and then it's the story of the Assyrians, and then it goes back to poetry again. It's kind of a weird structure there. Anyway, so Hezekiah is the king at this time. Here come the Assyrians. Take a look sometime at what happens. The representatives, not the king obviously of Assyria, but his representatives come up to the gate in Jerusalem, and they go, hello, and the Jews look down. They're not going to open the doors, so they just look down, and they start communicating back and forth. It's too long and too complicated, but really, really interesting. But sometime on your own, take a look, because there's psychological warfare going on at this time. What that representative says to the people of Israel and what they say back. And they don't really want to fight if they don't have to, so they're trying to get the Jews to feel so scared that they'll quit. So if you have a chance, read that sometime. So the Assyrians come. We know exactly what happened during this episode because they have unearthed this huge stone chiseled monument that was written by the king of Assyria at that time. His name was Sennacherib. They've got it. It's available. It's in a museum right now. So all of that little fine squiggly stuff is the writing, the Assyrian writing. And he boasts. He tells about coming in and wiping out the 10 tribes and I'm a tough guy. Well, you know the story. When he comes into Jerusalem, he does surround it, doesn't he? What's the story from that point? Do you know what happens?
He hears that there's a war somewhere else and he takes off.
And he's got tens of thousands of his own troops dead because the angel of the Lord comes down and strikes them. So he heads back to his own land. So you'd think, now he's a king, he's all-powerful king, he's going to boast in his writings. You'd think he'd say, yeah, I came down to Jerusalem and I took them. He doesn't say that. He says, I surrounded the king and I put him like a bird in a cage. But that's all he says, because that's all he did. He did surround him, and it was like Hezekiah was a bird in a cage, but he never lies. He doesn't say, yeah, and then I took the city. I thought that was weird. A king that has all power, has grandiose visions of himself almost like a god, but he's honest in this monument here. He just says, I just surrounded the city. Does not have a happy ending, by the way. Sennacherib goes back, he maintains his kingship, goes back to his land of Nineveh, and he's worshiping his god in a temple there, and his 2 sons sneak up on him and kill him. Happy Father's Day, huh? Anyway, so the Assyrians are pretty bad guys. Thank goodness all of these kingdoms do their thing in alphabetical order. Wasn't that nice of them? So the Assyrians are basically like middle 700s, say 750 BC. So just to give you that kind of time period as we're moving down toward the time of Jesus. Well, they fade, and in come the Babylonians. A, Assyrians, B, Babylonians, and then we'll get P, Persians. Isn't that nice? A, B, P, no C. But all right, good enough. I'm satisfied with that. Anything that'll help my mind remember these things. So the Babylonians rise. Now, what have they got left? Just those 2 tribes. So this king, his name is Nebuchadnezzar. And what does he do? He comes over, same thing, comes up from the north, comes down. And I told you before, these little people in Canaan had to watch out and see which side was strongest. Was it going to be Egypt, or was it going to be some land in Mesopotamia? So here comes Nebuchadnezzar. And there's that poor king in Israel looking around saying, well, do we just give in, or do we hope for Egypt's support? Well, he made a really bad choice. He decided Egypt would be strong enough to support me. No, bad choice. Egypt was not strong at this time, and so Nebuchadnezzar takes the city over, takes off everything that was of value and just levels the place. And now the southern 2 tribes are heading off into captivity. And we get this sad, sad song that is in the book of Psalms. Let me just read it. So remember, they've been hauled off because of the Babylonians. By the rivers of Babylon we sat and wept when we remembered Zion. There on the poplars we hung our harps, for there our captors asked us for songs. Our tormentors demanded songs of joy. They said, sing us one of the songs of Zion. How can we sing the songs of the Lord while in a foreign land? That's been turned into music, by the way. I don't know if anybody recognizes that, but it's the actual song, by the waters of Babylon, by the rivers of Babylon. But isn't that a sad song? They've been hauled off again. Another conqueror has come in and hauled these people off. So I don't know what that would be like. I've grown up in Southern California. I don't know what I'd be like in Iowa or someplace more foreign that was Afghanistan or someplace that's totally a different culture, a different God to worship, different ways of doing anything. You have no sights anymore. You're not where your ancestors were. You can't connect to the land at all. And so they sing a song like this. And to have their captors say, hey, we know you sing some really nice songs. Our songs are done. The harps are being hung up. We don't sing anymore. We're in this land. We're captive. Well, they disappear. Persians come on the scene next. I just wanted to give you an idea of the sweep of the Persian Empire. That's a chunk of real estate, isn't it? Down into Egypt. Again, Egypt was not particularly strong. They took Egypt. They go all the way to India. And what is fascinating to me is this little piece up here. This is northern Greece. But notice this part of Greece is not taken over. Anybody know what was going on in the 400s, let's say, 500 time period, BC? You know anything about the Greeks fighting off the Persians? You know about Thermopylae? Salamis, the naval battle, and things like that. That's what's going on. You got this border area here, and the Greeks refuse to knuckle under to these Persians. They see them as despots and tyrants and running a top-down government. Of course, the Greeks loved their freedom, and they fought among themselves. Wow, they fought themselves more than they fought the Persians. But they said no thanks, and they fought off an entire empire. I mean, that's an amazing period. Supposedly, Xerxes brought over to fight them something like 500,000 troops. And that's why something like Thermopylae was pretty interesting, because they found a spot in the mountains that was a choke point. And the Persians had to come through in a small group at a time to make it through that choke point. So 300 Spartans stand there and fight them off for quite a while until some traitor told the Persians there was a way around the mountain. But so that's where you get these stories of the Greeks standing up to the Persians. So there's this hatred, there's this hostility between the Greeks and the Persians that's developing during this time period. And one of the Greeks that comes on the scene, you know him, Alexander, comes in the late 300s or so, mid 300s, and he goes into Persia and he just kicks the door down. And you'd think the whole Persian Empire, as big as it is, could handle a little pipsqueak like Alexander. He had a fairly small army. The Persians had thousands and thousands and thousands of troops that they could have used, but they didn't succeed at all. Alexander was brilliant. He was the first person in the battle to head toward the enemy, and the rest of his troops would go, good grief, there's our commander, and then they'd have to run after him. He had wound after wound after wound, finally died of his wounds, but look how far he accomplished, how much territory he took, all the way to India again, until the troops finally said, hey, could we go home? Enough already. So the reason why he's in the story here, why I wanted to focus on him, is he came down into the land here, of the Holy Land, and down into Egypt, and kind of an ego trip, I guess, Alexandria, Egypt, named after himself. You get to do that if you conquer countries. So he's got this huge empire that doesn't last very long after him, but the big thing that he did, and this is what I want to stress, he introduced Greek culture. Everywhere he went, he introduced Greek culture. So what's the importance of that? Well, it affected the Holy Land. It affected the Jews during this time period. They end up creating a Bible, putting it into the Greek language because there were so many Greek speakers. It's called the Septuagint. I'm going to mention that in just another second. So let's just kind of tick off some of the things that are going on between the Testaments. So we're talking maybe 250 BC to the time of Jesus. So about 200 years here. You get something called the diaspora. The Jews are now being spread all over the place, aren't they? As conqueror after conqueror has come in and hauled them off. So they're spreading all over the world. So we're starting to get these Greek, the Jews are going all over the place. We're starting to get these little synagogues popping up different places. They can't worship at Jerusalem anymore. It's been taken from them again and again. So they're getting different worship centers as they move all over the place. That's what made it so effective for Paul. What was he able to do? He'd come into a community. What did he look for first? Synagogue, right? And he'd go to that synagogue, and that's where he got his toehold into that culture. And it was all because of that diaspora. They were spread all over the place. So they were looking for ways to maintain their community. And they could do that through a synagogue. The revolt of Maccabees, you ever heard of the Maccabees? That's where we get the idea of Hanukkah. The Maccabees had been a small group within Israel that hated to be ruled, and they threw off their rulers. And it's an amazing story. I think you'd enjoy reading about that. We start getting some different religious groups rising during this time. The Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes. The Essenes are not in the New Testament, but they play a big role that we'll talk about in a couple of minutes. Think of the Pharisees as the conservatives of their time period, and think of the Sadducees as the liberals. They didn't buy into some of the theology, and so they were not always best of friends, and Paul was able to get them arguing with each other. You know that story that's in the book of Acts. Rome, of course, comes on the scene at this time. They take over everything, you know how the Romans succeeded. They put in place Herod into the land there, and all of a sudden there's this big interest in a coming Messiah. And I'll tell you, one of the reasons I think there's a big interest is they'd read the book of Daniel. And the book of Daniel talks about the coming of a Messiah roughly during this time period. I think I've talked to this class about that, messianic prophecies and all. So that's the scene that Jesus is born into. Oh, too fast. So the Septuagint, I think I mentioned that before. The Greek culture is so powerful and it's all over the place. The Jews say, we need to translate our Bible into Greek so that others can read it and appreciate what we appreciate. And so about 200 BC, the Hebrew Bible gets translated into Greek, and the importance of this is the Bible that Jesus and the disciples refer to. Whenever they quote, they're quoting the Septuagint. So it was a big deal for the time of Jesus. The Apocrypha is written during this time period. Apocrypha means hidden. So these are little hidden works that never reached status of equality with all the books of the Old Testament or all the books of the New Testament. But the Jews thought, oh, some of them are pretty good reading. It's uplifting to the spirit. And the Roman Catholics thought it was uplifting enough that I think they still have it included in their Bibles today. Is that correct? Anybody have a Catholic Bible? The Protestants said no thanks, and so they don't include it in their Bible. Jesus never referred to any of these books. The disciples never referred to any of these books. The Jews did not consider them on an equal status with their books as well. There's the Maccabees story, by the way, taken in 1st and 2nd Maccabees. Great history. It's really interesting history. So if you ever have a Bible with a Apocrypha, read the Maccabees story of these little band of revolutionaries that knocked out a whole kingdom and allowed at least a little bit of freedom for the Jews before the Romans came in and took everything down. I chose this map for the Roman Empire because I wanted you to notice something. Do you see all the red? All those red lines? Looks like a bunch of arteries and stuff. The Romans were great engineers, weren't they? And so they had all these roads, and they had a time of peace called Pax Romana. That was a perfect time if you're going to spread a religion. Paul is able to go everywhere, and other disciples are able to go everywhere because there is peace. There's not a lot of that fighting going on, and the roads were excellent, and the travel by sea was improved. And so it's no wonder that Paul was able to spread this clear into Rome because of the transportation and all. I mentioned the Essenes before. They do play a role, even though they're not mentioned in the New Testament. They lived out in this just hostile place. They were like hermits. They gave up on Jerusalem. They gave up on the priest system there, and they said it's all corrupt. And they went out to live by the Dead Sea. Pretty arid looking, huh? And this is a part of it is being uncovered even to these days. And so they lived these little hermit-like lives out there. And they were the ones, of course, that stuffed away treasured pieces of their scripture when the Romans came through into these caves. And you probably know the story. A little Arab kid is out messing around, and is throwing rocks, and he threw a rock into one, I'm not sure that's the first one, but he threw a rock into one of these cave openings from down below, and he hears a ka-chink. That was an odd sound, and so he ends up getting up there, and I don't know how they got up there, it looks pretty scary. But they got up there and they found these clay vessels inside of which were a lot of writings. Now, some of them had nothing to do with the Bible, but many of them were copies of books of the Bible. And so they're called the Dead Sea Scrolls to these days. So what's the importance of the Dead Sea Scrolls as far as the Bible goes? Well, read from top to bottom with me. Most people believe Isaiah was around 700 BC. Before they found the Dead Sea Scrolls, the earliest copy, they didn't have any copy up until around 1000 AD. So what have you got? A time period of 1700 years there between when Isaiah wrote his original and the first copy we have. What do you think the danger might be, or at least the concern some people had?
They wouldn't interpret it correctly. They would do their own thing as time goes on.
Yeah. I mean, can you imagine just us, if we write something and then make a copy and then make a copy of that, we start getting sloppier and sloppier, and then things change over time, just in our lifetime. Imagine 700 years and then 1,000 years, 1,700 years altogether. It seems like a lot of translating and copying errors could pop up. So people said, well, we're not sure that that's really what Isaiah said if all we have is a document from the 1000s. So what did they do? They come across a complete manuscript scroll of Isaiah. By the way, that scroll is in Israel today. It's in a separate museum, and you can walk around it. They have it displayed. Have you seen it? Okay, some of you have seen it. Yeah. So that's the scroll of Isaiah, and guess what they discovered? It was from roughly 50 AD. So what have we done? We've cut more than half of that time out, haven't we? We've gone back from 1000 AD down to, let's round off, let's say 0. So you're 1,000 years closer to Isaiah. What's happened? They haven't found any major errors. It's something like 95 or 96% pure. Isn't that amazing? So you say, well, how is that possible? They weren't making Xerox copies. Well, when they copied their Bible, they did it so carefully. We're sloppy copiers today because we say, oh, we've got machines, we can put the documents on the computers and all. But they would sit there and they would count how many spaces in each line. They would count how many letters, and then they would make their copy and double check it. And if they had any error any place, they didn't just scratch it out. They threw that away, got a new thing out. They dressed a certain way. They washed before they did it. It was an act of worship to do a copy. And so no wonder it was extremely accurate. So thank goodness, huh? Let's move to the New Testament. I'm going to spend less time on the Gospels because you're probably most familiar with those, but I think it's interesting that there are 4 Gospels instead of just one story about Jesus. We get, again, the creativity of God saying, go ahead, describe Jesus the way you would like to describe him. And so Matthew sees Jesus as Jewish, and so we get the most references to the Old Testament, and he's always running genealogies back to the time of the Jews. Jesus is a very Jewish Messiah. Mark, fast pace. Luke, a Gentile, Jesus for the entire world. Jesus is the Savior. Luke has many more women in his stories. He probably used Mary as one of the sources. John gives us the gosh wow Jesus, the Jesus of cosmic proportions, right? In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He takes Jesus back to pre-time, doesn't he, with God? And he has some really interesting things to say about him. So we have the 4 different Gospels. Luke wrote 2 books, wrote the book of Luke, and what else? Acts, right. And so people who've been historians and interested in history say, well, can we trust him? Is he a good historian? And he comes across with flying colors. Historian after historian has said, amazing. This man, when he would talk in Acts of the trips of Paul or whatever, he would get his geography right. I won't take the time on this, but he'd get his geography right. He'd get the culture right. I'll just give you one example, culture. So he would say, they went into such and such a city, and then he'd come up with the name of whatever the leading member was of that city. Now, we would say maybe a mayor, but mayors are all over the country. Well, in those days, each city was like its own little city-state, and they would have different terms for whoever were the high-ups in office. But he knew that. He got that all correct. He'd name in the Greek word whatever that term was for the person in that city, be different than that city, and be different in a different city. So he got all of that correct. He got the ships and the sailing right. He knew when to sail, he knew where to sail, he knew what the winds were like. This is not somebody that's writing 300 or 400 years later. This is somebody who knew that particular time period. So we can trust the eyewitness reports of people like Luke. I wanted to, you know I'm a map person, so I got another map for you here. But I want to illustrate something important. Paul does 3 famous missionary voyages, right? First one, he sticks to Asia. He's in this area, and he goes back. Then, do you remember he has this vision? It's kind of like mid-Acts. He has a vision of a man from Macedon who says, we need you, come on over. So where's Macedon? Up here. And you say, okay, so he went across and crossed a little bit of water to get there. Well, it's more important than that. This, over to the right, is considered Asia. This, over on the left, is considered part of Europe today. So you say, well, what's the difference? This would be like backwoods, rural. It didn't play a huge role in the Roman Empire. Where's the power for the Roman Empire? It's over here. Off the screen, obviously, in Rome, but this is culture. This is civilization. This is advanced thinking from here on over. So when Paul makes that big jump, it's a huge jump when he jumps from here over to here, because now he's entering society. He's entering the high-tech world of that time. So that message then can go a lot faster as he moves into these more powerful areas. You recognize, I'm sure, some of these places where he set up a church and then had to respond to them in some letters. You can see Ephesus there, for example. But look at these over here that he established in the part of the Greek world. Philippi becomes Philippians when he writes to them. Thessalonica, the Thessalonian letters. We get Corinth down here. He does a great sermon in Athens. Familiar with that one? It's a powerful sermon that he gives. So I just wanted you to think about that. Yes, he does 3 trips, and yes, he follows some of the same areas, but it's that big jump when he comes over here where now he's in the downtown area of world civilization. So we got all these letters of Paul in the New Testament. I want you to notice something. You look at that and you go, well, I hope you think about, well, why are they in this order? I think when I was younger, I figured they were chronological. Maybe? But that's not true. Galatians, actually, that 4th one over from the left was his first one. Does anybody notice anything? Let's do it this way. I'm going to read them up to Timothy. So it's Romans, it's Corinthians, it's Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and it's Thessalonians. Do those things have anything in common?
Churches.
They're churches. They're cities where churches were started. All of a sudden, something happens there. Timothy, Titus, Philemon are those churches. Those are people. They're called the pastoral letters. So then, all right, so we got a basic division right there, don't we? We've got the letters to the churches and we got the letters to the individuals. Then when you go back here and you take a look, you notice anything about the size as you move from Romans down to...
You said getting smaller?
Yeah, they're getting smaller, right? We start with the big ones, the biggest, the largest number of chapters and words, and we move to the smaller. And the same thing happens when we go to the Timothys and Titus and Philemon. By the way, nobody ever reads Philemon. That's a great letter. Anybody done that one? You gone through Philemon? It's amazing the psychology that Paul pulls off here, because he's got this runaway slave, Onesimus, and he wants to give him back, but he doesn't want to give him back if the owner, Philemon, is going to do awful things to him. And so Paul's got to write, in a sense, a flattering letter. He's got to write a letter that basically says, you owe me, but he wants to do it in a nice way, because he worked with Philemon. Philemon is a Christian, and Onesimus has become a Christian. Do you know there are puns in the letter? Again, if you have a study Bible, you'll love Philemon. It's a great read. But most people ignore it. It's too bad. All right, so does that make sense? We're going actually from largest to smallest as far as the letters to the churches, and largest to smallest letters to the individuals. This is actually the chronological order that Paul wrote his letters. Galatians is his earliest. What I think is interesting is when you read Philippians, it seems like the key word of Philippians is joy. And yet he's at the end of his life and he's imprisoned, probably chained, and he's writing about joy. Talk about not worrying about your circumstances, because he's got the big picture. I don't know about you, but I get tunnel vision often, and I worry and get concerned about the small stuff, and Paul's got the big picture. Hey, things are fine. And he's full of joy even at the end of his life. We have other New Testament letters, of course, Hebrews and James and Peter and John and Jude and Revelation. If that's okay, I want to spend just a second on Revelation. It's really a part of what's called apocalyptic writing. People today, all of us here, we read it and we say, this is weird. This has got all these strange animals and it just seems kind of odd, and maybe we should not even mess with it. But for the Jews, it was a particular style of writing. It was not unusual to them at all. In fact, it's going to sound weird, but I would suggest it'd be like us reading science fiction today. For some people, they read it and go, that's kind of weird. Well, yeah, but it's a style of writing. And so the same thing was going on there. It's not just Revelation. It's in the Old Testament, parts of Joel, but certainly Ezekiel and Zechariah have the same kinds of writing. It's a style. It's something the Jews were familiar with. Well, what goes on in these books? You get strange beasts. You get nature that actually acts. There's places in Revelation where the earth splits apart and swallows water that's being spewed out by this evil person. You get battle of good against evil. You get, what I think is interesting, you get the known transformed into the unknown. You get a bustling city, but then it's described as if everybody's gone. You get the sun being described as doing something odd. You get the moon turned to blood. You get the stars falling out of the sky. You get all these odd things going on. It's science fiction. Now, I don't mean it's fiction in the sense it's made up, but it has some of those same kind of qualities where you're not comfortable anymore. And I think that was one of the points of writing it. Don't get comfortable. God's bigger. He's going to enter into this world and shake things up. And it certainly has a cosmic setting, doesn't it? I just picked two pictures I thought might illustrate a little bit the feel for Revelation. I don't even know what's going on here, but I think those pictures capture it. Something's weird in the sun there, I guess. Looks like a eclipse of some kind, but is the city burning? I don't know. Over here, just the clouds and stuff coming out of the earth, and just the feeling of awe. God's bigger than everything else. So, interesting conclusion here, I think. You had 66 books in the Bible, 40 authors, done on 3 different continents over a span of 2,000 years, done in 3 different languages. That's 3, right? Part of it is Hebrew, obviously, and Greek, and parts of it Aramaic. So you got 3 different languages, different genres of literature, and yet this Bible has one message, doesn't it? It's got a beginning, and it's got history going someplace, and it ends up in the area of Revelation, time to come, God coming back, things will be set right. I would challenge anybody, try to write a book in this format and make it have sense. That seems impossible to me. You're really going to get 66 books, put them together, and it's going to tell one story? I don't think so. You're going to get 40 authors to get together and create a book, and it's going to make sense? It's going to be one harmonious story? No. You're going to have that book take 2,000 years to complete, and you're going to pick out over those 2,000 years different books, put them together, and it's going to make sense? No, this is the only book that does that. I mean, sometimes we don't appreciate how amazing the Bible itself is. We read it, but we don't appreciate the variety and the oddness of all these years and have it all compile and have it all make beautiful sense together. Impressive. So, back to the little puzzle pieces. What were we trying to do here? Put the puzzles back together and see the Bible as a whole. If you want, feel free to email me. I've got an article. If you'd like to go through the Bible, but you get bogged down in Leviticus. You'd like to do the whole Bible, and somewhere along Leviticus, those laws make your eyes roll up in your head. If you want, email me. I'll give you something. I just call it Best of the Best, and it runs through just what I was talking about today, and I just pick out chapters that will give you a feel for the flow of the Bible, moving from Genesis to Revelation. Not the whole Bible, it's about a third or fourth of the Bible, but it'll give you a good feel for the whole thing